I want to start this video off with this simple exercise that I'm sure you've done before in the past. I'm gonna say a word, and I want you to close your eyes now and picture the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word. Are you ready? Monster. What do you see? I bet some of you thought of notorious serial killers like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or John Wayne Gacy. But out of all these names I mentioned, I bet there was one person that not a single one of you watching this video right now pictured. Let me introduce you to Charles Whitman III, one of the most terrifying yet intriguing men to ever walk this earth. And by the end of this video, you may wonder to yourself just how you've never heard of this monster. Born on June 24th, 1941 in Lake Worth, Florida, Charles Whitman III was born to his mother Margaret Whitman and Charles Jr. Whitman, whom he was named after. Along with Charles Whitman III, Charles Whitman Jr. and Margaret Whitman had two other boys. Charles Whitman III was the oldest out of the three. Whitman Jr., Charles' father, was raised in an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia, and he was described by himself and his peers as a self-made man. He ran a plumbing business alongside his first wife, Margaret Whitman. Whitman Jr. even had a brief political stint where he was elected to the Democratic Party's County Executive Committee. Needless to say, he was a public figure who had the respect and admiration of most of his peers, if not all. While Charles Whitman Jr. may have had an unblemished public image, the same can't be said about his personal life, as he did have a few skeletons in his closet. You see, Whitman Jr. was known as an authoritarian, believing that his word was the final say within his household, and if he sensed even the slightest trace of defiance or imperfection, he would emotionally and even physically abuse his wife and his children. Growing up, Charles Whitman III was known to have been a polite, sweet young boy. He was raised alongside his brothers as a Roman Catholic, attending Mass with his mother. He and his two brothers were altar boys, showing that they had a strong dedication and appreciation for religion during their childhood. As a hobby, Whitman Jr. was a firearms collector, and he taught his children how to shoot. He would take his boys on occasional hunting trips, and no one showed more promise than Whitman III. Whitman Jr. said by the time Charles had turned 16, he could shoot the eye out of a squirrel. And above all else, Charles Whitman III was considered to be incredibly intelligent, boasting an IQ of 139 at 6 years old. IQ stands for intelligent quotient, and while it's not the end-all be-all, it is a solid impartial metric to measure a person's intelligence. For Charles to have such a high IQ at a young age shows how promising his future was to be. And if you take a look at his early accomplishments, that does seem to be the case. Charles joined the Boy Scouts of America at the age of 11. Every Boy Scout's end goal is to obtain the rank of Eagle Scout. It is the highest and most significant award or ranking a Boy Scout can obtain, and it normally takes a while, takes about 4 to 6 years. Would you like to take a guess as to how long it took Charles to obtain his Eagle Scout? Like I said before, he joined the Boy Scouts at 11, and he obtained his Eagle Scout in 1 year. At the age of 12, Charles Whitman III earned the title of Eagle Scout. At that time, he was the youngest to ever accomplish that feat. To add some more context to it, in order to become an Eagle Scout in today's age, you have to obtain all the previous ranks along with 21 merit badges and do a service project. The previous ranks that you have to earn are as follow. They are Scout, Tenderfoot, Second Class, First Class, Star, Life, and then finally you are eligible to obtain an Eagle Scout. But like I mentioned, you also have to earn a mandatory amount of 21 predetermined merit badges. One of the 21 merit badges that you have to earn is a First Aid merit badge. And here are the following requirements necessary to obtain the First Aid merit badge. Seems like it's pretty taxing and that there's a lot to do, doesn't it? Well, that's just one out of 21 of the merit badges. And the final requirement in order to obtain an Eagle Scout is completion of a service project, where a Boy Scout demonstrates leadership through a service project that they hold that is meant to benefit their local community in some way. After the completion of all of this, a Boy Scout is then eligible for a board of review, in which it's basically an interview between a Boy Scout and 3 to 4 other Scout masters on whether or not the Boy Scout deserves the rank of Eagle Scout. And the Scout masters will either pass or fail a Scout depending on their findings within the board of review. But like I mentioned earlier, that's for today's Boy Scouts. Whitman III obtained the rank of Eagle Scout in the 1950s. So you'd expect it to be a lot easier back then, right? It actually doesn't seem to have been all that much different in obtaining your Eagle Scout back then than it is today. The only difference being is that there's one rank you didn't have to earn back then compared to today's requirements. That one rank being the Scout rank, which, if you remember, is the first rank to obtain in today's Boy Scout requirements. Whereas back then in the 1950s, the rank of Scout just didn't exist. The first rank you actually had to put in work to obtain back then was the Tenderfoot, which in today's scouting world is the second rank that you have to put in work for. But in the 1950s, you still had to earn the 21 merit badges that you have to earn in today's scouting requirements, and you still had to do a service project. So all of that is still the same. So Charles Whitman III was able to obtain his Eagle Scout while doing 99% of the same amount of work that any Boy Scout does in today's world to obtain his Eagle Scout. And he did it all in 1 year. And to speak more about his young accomplishments that showed promise, at 12 years old, he was already an accomplished pianist, and he started his own paper route business, where he would deliver newspapers to people within his community. During high school, Charles was a fairly popular young man. He seemingly got along with everyone, and as you'd expect, he excelled in school and worked incredibly hard. While still in high school, he used the money that he made from his paper route business and bought his first motorcycle, which he would go on to use for his paper route business. Although it seemed like life was going well from the outside for young Charles, a look deeper tells you the opposite, as he was still being abused by his father, Charles Whitman Jr. One night, Charles had returned home after a night of drinking, and his father had noticed that he was seemingly drunk. So as the story goes, he beat Charles and threw him into the family swimming pool as punishment for coming home in that state of intoxication. This event made Charles come to a decision to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. Just after 1 month of his graduation from high school in 1959, and he had enlisted without telling his father. Charles left home on July 6th, having been assigned to an 18-month tour of duty with the Marines at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Upon learning of his son's enlistment, Whitman Jr. called the federal government as a means to have the young man's enlistment canceled. But it didn't pan out in Jr.'s favor, as the federal government still allowed Charles to serve. During Charles' service in 1959 and 1960, he earned a sharpshooter badge and the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal. He scored 215 out of 250 possible points on marksmanship tests, showing his proficiency in skills in rapid-fire shooting over long distances, as well as at moving targets. After completing his assignment, Charles applied for a scholarship to the Naval Enlisted Science and Education Program, an initiative designed to send enlisted personnel to college in order to become engineers and then be commissioned as officers upon graduation. Charles earned high scores on the required examination, and the selection committee approved his enrollment at a prep school in Maryland, where he completed courses in mathematics and physics before transferring to the University of Texas at Austin to study mechanical engineering. In September 1961, Charles entered the mechanical engineering program at UT Austin. In contrast to his high school performance, Charles was initially a poor student in college. He spent a lot of his time hunting. Early into his enrollment, Charles and two of his friends were observed poaching a deer. Poaching is the illegal hunting or fishing within another person's land without their permission. So while hunting is legal in most places, the fact is Charles and his friends were breaking the law by hunting on another person's land without their permission. A nearby bystander saw the trio, and they decided to write down Charles's license plate and report him to the police. The trio were actively butchering the deer in the shower at Whitman's dorm when they were arrested by the police. Charles was issued to pay a fee of what translates to 1,000 USD in today's currency. Aside from this blemish on Charles's public record, he was known to be a joker among his friends, but even his friends noticed that his sense of humor could get disturbing quite often. In 1962, he remarked to a fellow student, he said, "A person could stand off an army from atop of the main building's clock tower before the army got to him." In February of 1962, Charles met Kathleen Frances Leisner, an education major. They dated for about 5 months before deciding to get engaged on July 19, 1962, the same year that they met. On August 17th of 1962, Whitman and Leisner were married in a Catholic ceremony held in Leisner's hometown of Needville, Texas. The couple had chosen the 22nd as it was the same day in which Charles's parents were celebrating their 22nd anniversary. Charles's family drove from Florida to attend the event, and his younger brother Patrick served as his best man. Leisner's family and friends approved of her choice of husband, describing Charles as a handsome young man who was both intelligent and aspirational. While his love life showed significant improvement, the same could not be said about his academic career. Charles's grades did improve somewhat during his second and third semester. However, the Marine Corps deemed it as insufficient for continuation of his scholarship. He was ordered to active duty on February 1963 and went to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina for the remainder of his 5-year enlistment. While on deployment, Charles was promoted automatically to Lance Corporal. However, He still resented and held deep animosity towards the government, and more specifically, the Marine Corps, for abruptly ending his college studies. Despite having an above-stellar reputation as a Marine, Charles went on to act incredibly reckless. He was consistently gambling and attempted to exploit others through offering them loans of money. Ultimately, this behavior led Charles to be court-martialed for the following: gambling, usury, possession of personal firearm on base, and threatening another Marine over a $300 loan, for which he demanded an additional $150 in interest. While waiting for his court-martial, Charles began to write a diary titled Daily Record of C.J. Whitman. He wrote about his daily life in the Marine Corps and his interactions with his wife and other family members. He journaled about his newfound contempt for the Marine Corps, as Charles felt he did nothing wrong and that the court-martial was unjust. In his journal, Charles did express love and longing for his wife, saying he wished he could be with her and he wished he could provide for the two of them without having to depend on his father. The ruling in his court-martial ruled that Charles was to be sentenced to 30 days of confinement and 90 days of hard labor. He was demoted from lance corporal to private. In the subsequent year, Charles Whitman III would be honorably discharged from the United States Marine Corps, never to serve ever again. Upon his honorable discharge, Charles returned to UT Austin, enrolling in the architectural engineering program. He worked as a bill collector for the Standard Finance Company as a means to support himself and his wife. However, this would be the first of many jobs that Charles took in order to fill that role of a provider. He would later go on to be a bank teller, and after being a bank teller, he was a traffic surveyor. It was clear that the man was experiencing problems holding down a job. Charles did go back to scouting as a volunteer scout leader with one of the local Austin troops. Perhaps it was a way for Charles to relive his former notable accomplishments. After moving back to Austin, some of Charles's friends had later said that Charles confessed to them that he had struck his wife on 3 separate occasions. Charles had shared with his friends his feelings of deep shame for his abuse towards his wife Kathleen. He lamented that he was more like his father than he wanted to admit, and that this deeply troubled him. In his journal, Charles spoke about his actions and resolved to be a better husband and to discontinue the path of abuse that he had started. In May of 1995, Charles's mother, Margaret, filed for divorce against Charles Whitman Jr., as she had had enough of his continued physical abuse. Charles drove to Florida to aid his mother in moving out. He was so scared of the chance that his father would become violent that he had asked a police officer to stand outside while he helped his mother move out. Margaret moved to Austin to be near her eldest son. She started working as a cafeteria lady and moved to her own apartment while still keeping in contact with Charles. Charles Whitman Jr. stated that he had spent roughly $10,000 USD in order to speak to his wife and his son across state lines, begging his ex-wife to come back. He even went as far as to ask Charles to put in a good word for him, despite their obviously strained relationship. And it was during this time that Charles had decided to start abusing amphetamines, causing him severe headaches. It was not long after Charles's abuse of amphetamines that Charles Whitman III would do something that could only be described as one word: monstrous. On the day before the incident, Charles bought a pair of binoculars and a knife from a hardware store. He picked up his wife from her summer job before he met his mother for lunch at the Wyatt cafeteria, which was close to the UT Austin campus. The day was July 31st, 1966, and at 6:45 p.m., Charles began writing his suicide note, a portion of which read as this: Charles went on to request an autopsy be performed on his remains after he was dead to determine if there had been a biological cause for his actions and for his continuing and increasingly intense headaches. In his letter, he stated he wanted to kill both his wife and his mother, not out of malice, but due to feeling sorry for them and wishing that they both could have had better lives. He states he wanted to save them from the embarrassment and shame upon the actions he was planning to commit. A little past midnight, Charles drove to his mother's apartment and proceeded to kill her. It is unclear as to how he did it, but it's speculated he rendered her unconscious and stabbed her, piercing her heart. After killing his mother, he placed her body on the bed and covered it with sheets. He left a handwritten note beside her body, which read in part as the following: Charles then returned to his home, where he killed his wife by stabbing her 5 times in the chest as she slept. He covered her body with sheets, then continued writing his suicide note. On the envelope, Charles wrote the following chilling statement: "I never could quite make it. These thoughts are too much for me." It was 11:35 a.m., August 1st, 1966. Charles had arrived on the UT Austin campus. He falsely identified himself as a research assistant and lied to a security guard that he was there to deliver equipment. He then climbed to the 28th floor of the main building's clock tower, the same tower he had previously joked about to his friend, and he proceeded to shoot and kill 3 people within the tower. He then opened fire from the observation deck with a hunting rifle and other weapons. It took 96 minutes for Charles to be stopped. 96 long minutes. In that time, Charles Whitman III killed a total of 15 people and injured 31 others. Officers Houston McCoy and Ramiro Martinez raced to the top of the tower, and they proceeded to shoot and kill Charles Whitman III. Upon review of his medical history, officers found that Whitman III had visited several UT Austin physicians in the year before the shootings. He was prescribed a plethora of medications. Charles had seen at least 5 doctors between the fall and winter of 1965. One of his doctor's visits was to Jan Cockrum, who prescribed him Valium, an anxiolytic drug for major anxiety disorder, and recommended he visit the campus psychiatrist. Charles met with Maurice Dean Heatley, the staff psychiatrist at the University of Texas Health Center, on March 29, 1966. He referred to his visit with Dr. Heatley in his final suicide note, writing the following message. Dr. Heatley's note on the visit said the following: "This massive, muscular youth seemed to be oozing with hostility, that something seemed to be happening to him, and that he didn't seem to be himself. He readily admits having overwhelming periods of hostility with a very minimum of provocation. Repeated inquiries attempting to analyze his exact experiences were not too successful, with the exception of his vivid reference to thinking about going on the tower with a deer rifle and start shooting people." On August 2nd, the day after the incident, Dr. Coleman Deschanard, a neuropathologist at Austin State Hospital, realized the autopsy at the funeral home. Charles's urine and blood were tested for amphetamines, along with other undisclosed drugs. During the autopsy, Dr. Deschanard reported that he discovered a pecan-sized brain tumor above the red nucleus and the white matter below the gray center thalamus within the brain, which he identified it as an astrocytoma with a slight sign of necrosis. But this was later corrected to a glioblastoma multiforme with widespread areas of necrosis. John Connally, then governor of Texas, commissioned a task force to examine the autopsy findings and material related to Charles's actions and motives. The commission was composed of neurosurgeons, psychiatrists, pathologists, and psychologists, and included the University of Texas Health Center directors Dr. John White and Dr. Maurice Heatley. The commission toxicology tests revealed nothing significant. They examined Dr. Deschanard's paraffin blocks of the brain tumor. They stained specimens of it along with Charles's other brain tissue, and in addition to the remainder of the autopsy specimens available. Psychiatric contributors to the report concluded that the relationship between the brain tumor and Charles's actions cannot be established with clarity. However, the tumor conceivably could have contributed to his inability to control his emotions and actions. The neurologists and neuropathologists were more circumspect, concluding that the application of existing knowledge of organic brain function does not enable us to explain the actions of Charles Whitman III on August 1st. Forensic investigators who have looked into the case have theorized that the tumor pressed against Charles's amygdala, which is a part of the brain that regulates anxiety and the fight or flight response among numerous other functions. What is a monster? Really think about it. Does it mean to not be human? If you look at it superficially, you may say, yeah, that's right. But you probably wouldn't call a cute dog a monster, would you? What about a young bully who teases and pokes at another kid? Maybe they're acting in a less than stellar manner, but you probably wouldn't call them a monster, would you? The term monster is only left for the absolute worst of the worst, the bottom cesspool of the world. Those who disregard others' well-being and the sanctity of human life. Those that disregard any rational or emotional thoughts and reasoning. And by that very definition, I have described to you not just a monster, but Charles Whitman III.